Well, hello. I haven't done one of these in a while. And don't worry about the date there. That was wrong. The battery kind of went dead on this and it reset the date. So this was actually taken about a week ago, March. What would that be? Slide a view of date on top, March 10th, 2019. We just had about 9 inches of snow the night before, which was all sorts of fun. Got my exercise, got to go out and shovel a little bit, right? Yeah. All shoveled by hand because I don't have a snowblower. But anyway, the car was a little bit stuck, so you'll see parts of this. I didn't run the whole thing. Yep, there I am. It was stuck. Not because of my shoveling, but because after I shoveled, the snowplow went by and threw a whole bunch of snow underneath the car. So I was really battling to get that stuff out, and it was more work than I thought it would be. I ended up laying on my stomach to drag snow out from under the car. It was horrible. And I spared you most of that footage. So this video isn't so much about that. Well, it's kind of just a quick drive around town, mostly to run the car because I haven't really gone anywhere. And I did need to go to the grocery store and the hardware store. One of the reasons I had to go to the hardware store is I managed to shatter 2 snow shovels this winter and none left. So I needed one. Luckily, they still had one. Like I said, I excised most of the digging there. I headed out. This street was plowed, the other way was not, so this is the way I went. But actually what inspired this video today, besides the fact I haven't done one of these in a while, is I got a phone call on Friday. I was in the process of preparing my normal pens in use and IGTV video, and I had the day off, so, of course I waited till the last minute because that's what you do, right? But anyway, I got a phone call. A friend of mine is possibly dying. Of course, there was the natural shock, and that pretty well killed any mood to go talk about pens in use and all that. I will say the phone call was not a surprise, but it's always a shock when the moment comes. And it's Sunday now. He's still hanging on as far as I've heard. So, maybe this isn't the end, but I do know that the end is coming. I was going to do a Saturday trip to Bismarck, as part of my spring break and time off, but I just really couldn't build up the enthusiasm for that. I am feeling better today, obviously. And I got to thinking about his life. He's one of those people, without getting too specific, many people know and respect him. He's one of those people who's going to be missed. He was always a very welcoming man. I remember he and his wife took my parents and I around his ranch. My parents and I, of course, are from the East Coast. My parents didn't know much about ranching at all, so he's a rancher. So he took them around, and they got to see the scale of ranching here in western North Dakota. Very good neighbor. You won't find too many people who criticize him. He has a good family. Maybe not all of them meet what would be the traditional definitions of success, but he has 2 kids he can be proud of. He has grandchildren he can be proud of, and great-grandchildren he can be proud of. This is a good man who's going to be missed. And it just got me thinking about people who die alone. You read about them every so often. Nobody notices until days or weeks or even months later. These are people that seem to have slipped through the cracks. They don't have any connections. And there can be lots of reasons for that, not always within your control or your fault. I just can't help but think, if I die here, people will notice pretty quickly. But what if I retire from teaching, move to some small town in Vermont, and then slip walking outside the house or fall down the stairs, and nobody's going to know me? Not my fault. I mean, I moved there. I just didn't have a life of building connections like I have had here. So I don't blame the person for that. And I know that some people are just magical at making connections. I'll share a little personal story here about my grandfather. He was magical at making connections wherever he went. He could talk to anybody. Here I am at the grocery store that's outside of town and walking toward the hardware store because I don't drive from store to store. But anyway, my grandfather was magical at making connections. And to illustrate that, he and my grandmother stopped at Kmart one day, part of their thing they did. And we're debating where to have lunch. There was, I guess, a little cafe or whatever Kmart has. I haven't been in a Kmart in years. I don't know where the nearest one is. But anyway, they were debating where to have it when he had a stroke right there in the store. Now, what's interesting about that story is the people who worked at the Kmart were calling and asking the hospital about him. Now, none of them knew his name. But because of all the times he'd been in there and just his interactions with the different people working there, they knew who he was. And they cared, and they wanted to know how he was. And I think that's just a great story that shows the kind of person my grandfather was. Now, I'll be honest, his wife, my grandmother, didn't make those kind of connections. A lot of the connections she made were because of him. She was a lot more shy, a lot more introverted. She did spend a time, I guess, up through the 80s, where she was active in the community, but she let herself cut back and just become, well, I'll just say it. When she died mostly alone and unremarked, except by family, of course. That doesn't make her a bad person, but she just never made those connections with people. And some of that, of course, was depression after my grandfather died. She had a lot of people who wanted to reach out and make those connections, and she just couldn't allow them. She just couldn't. She couldn't deal with a lot of things after he died. Again, I'm not blaming her after 50 years of being married to somebody who is suddenly gone and who is sort of a larger-than-life figure. That's really hard to make the adjustment. I can't help but think how my grandfather would have handled the same situation, and he would have been the one at assisted living or in the nursing home who everybody was stopping in to visit. It's just the kind of person he was. He could make connections. And I'll just say this, we all have our crew, no matter what people think of our crew. It can be where we work. You'll read about people who, after they die, or I'm sorry, get that backwards, wow, who, after they retire, they're dead within 6 months because work was their whole life. We're a social species. Our neighbors can be part of our crew. Our family should be part of our crew. Our friends are part of our crew. Even like my grandfather, are the connections at local stores. Sometimes we'll form an ad hoc crew at a meeting or in a class we're taking. And the thing with my grandfather is he could reach out and make those connections. I don't have that skill. I struggle a lot to do it. If you met me in person, I am not as social as I seem on YouTube. I'm more likely to be the quiet one sitting back and listening rather than the one doing all the talking or just reaching out. I just struggle to reach out. That's one of my weaknesses, I guess. Now, your crew can form in many ways. Because of FERPA, I used to be an EMT, so I can't be specific here at all, and I have to avoid details. But I remember one person we took to the hospital. A lot of people would say his connections were not worthy. They would really look down on their connections. I'll just put it this way. his social connections were mostly around substance abuse. But one day when his health took a bad turn and he wasn't able to show up, these people cared and they got help. They went and checked on him and got help for him. He had a crew that noticed and cared about him. I think sometimes of a suicide that happened in my early days of teaching. It was a student I had never taught, but he was still in college. And one night made a couple of bad choices. And as a result of those bad choices, decided to take his own life. I don't want to dwell on that part of it, but I think what's stunning, and maybe it would have been good if he could have realized this, is the number of connections he had. The hundreds of people who drove to come to his funeral in this little remote town in North Dakota. The people who came to his funeral overflowed the available facilities for his funeral. He was surrounded by people who noticed and cared about him and who loved him. And it's just too bad when he was making choices that evening that he didn't realize the connections he had. Now, suicide, of course, would be another topic, and usually when you're at that point in your life, there's a lot more going on. So I will leave that to the mental health professionals. But I will just say, this is a young man who had a lot of connections and who really could have gone somewhere and would have gone somewhere despite his mistakes that he'd made that night. And sometimes why we don't make connections, it's we hide too much of ourselves. We're afraid of being laughed at or scorned. I was like that. I can still be like that. I think of a 14-year-old student who died in a car accident. After she died, at her funeral, a lot of us discovered she was a poet and she was an artist. These were all things that nobody knew. Because she, I don't know why, typical 14-year-old and typical 14-year-old culture, probably was embarrassed by it. Didn't want people to know about it. Was afraid people would make fun of her, so she hid that part of herself. And sadly, I will say that she was probably in a culture that would have scorned her for those things. So she had to put on an act in order to fit in. I think sometimes if you're more confident in who you are, you can get away with it. But the teenage culture can be very cruel. I had a high school student I taught, or I didn't teach him, at a school where I taught, who moved there partway through the year and ended up dying that spring in a accident. And it was kind of stunning to me how much everybody was affected. This is a kid who, he had family in the area, but he hadn't gone to school there really. But in his brief few months in the school, he had reached out and made a lot of connections. He made connections to me. We'd talk a little bit each day. Not deep conversations or anything, but conversations where you'd reach out and talk. And when he died in the accident, I was personally connected to him. I felt the grief, even though I'd taught him. He wasn't just a statistic or that general thing, being in the profession I am affected when a teenager dies, but it was deeper than that, because this was somebody who'd reached out and we had connected. This is not as happy a story, but it makes me think also of my own high school days. I had a classmate who, and I was in a small school, I will say that too, who brutally and unnecessarily committed a murder and some other crimes as well. And really stuns me, especially in retrospect. But it surprised me then, too. I had no idea who he was. Now, at its biggest, my class had about 70 students. No clue who the guy was. A couple of my classmates, oh, I sat beside him in English. And, apparently he didn't come to school that often, so there was that. But when I think about how the school reacted to it, yes, there was reaction, there was outrage and all that, but just a very muted, understated reaction to the whole thing. Why? He really didn't have many connections to anybody. Maybe that's part of why he did what he did. I don't want to read into it too deeply. I'm going, of course, on a memory from a time when I was a teenager. But, in a class of 72, at the most, I should have at least known his face or his name. But nope, nothing. So I'll just say that there are lots of ways you can form that community. Some of us are naturally introverted. I am not so much as I used to be. I used to be very shy. I probably wouldn't be able to succeed as a teacher if I'd continued with that. But being introverted isn't necessarily a limitation. There's lots of ways you can reach out and make connections with the world. I'm reaching out and making connections, not the same, but here online. I do make connections in real life. I'm just a lot slower than people like my grandfather to make them. I do have friends. I'll joke that I don't have friends, but, I do have friends. I do have people who like me. I do have people who seek me out. I'm not one of those who people are always at my house or coming in to see me, but I make those connections. So being introverted isn't a limitation. It's just a different way of making connections. We are a social species, and we do all seek connections. In fact, I would recommend Kurzgesagt's video on loneliness as something to think about, especially in our modern era when people are struggling to make those connections. And part of it is exactly what I'm doing here, this online thing, this virtual life isn't the same as a real life human connection. I was kind of struggling here to find a side street to get back to my house that was plowed, where I wouldn't get my Camry stuck. And then some people start getting into this beta versus alpha thing. The words weren't around then, but my grandfather kind of had that attitude sometimes. More of the tough guy is the one who's going to make the connections and so on. And that was one of his weaknesses. I don't really want to get into that's a whole blech, and it's just so silly. Yes, the guy's in your face and going around making all these superficial hey there and all that. Yeah, you'll remember them, but that's a first impression. What's coming next? What's going to be deeper? So I don't know if I really came to any conclusions here. It's just something with this friend of mine that's dying. I just got to thinking about his life. I got involved with an older community, and it's just been one of the things when you get involved with older people is that they do die. And a lot of them seem to be dying very quickly, or they have Alzheimer's or, dementia, and you're just seeing the death of the person, even if they're still around. And it just kind of made me think about my own life and where am I headed, and I don't know, I just felt this need to share it. I'll say this, more driving videos are coming. I lost my way after I destroyed the hard drive that had all the footage on it, but I have collected some more footage since then, and I'm starting to get more free time. I'd like to finish my teacher shortage video, especially since we need some teachers and don't know if we'll find them. I'm going to continue, of course, reviewing pens. That's the backbone of my channel, I guess. But I want to get a little bit more into how they're used. I want to talk a little bit about writing and note-taking and some personal improvement and organization things. Yes, it's interesting to talk about fountain pens, and I love the niche I've found where I talk about these less common, less well-known pens. But I want to talk more about the pen life and what they're used for. I parked here in the street so I could shovel out the driveway, the part that I didn't get while the car was sitting on it, and not get stuck again. So there you go. That's why I'm sitting here in the street. But anyway, expect more driving videos, and a good lesson to me this week was, well, besides the personal one, this is why I should be filming my videos ahead of time, not wait till the last minute, because life comes up, and wow, did life come up on Friday. I don't think it would have been a very good pens in use. And I just started working on a project I was excited about, and woof, that just took the wind out of my sails. I guess that's a reflection of the kind of connections he's made with me and with other people. And it's a reminder to all of us that we want to make those kind of connections too. Not only are they good to other people, they're good for us too. Those social connections are a big piece of human health, and I feel like there's a driving video in there somewhere about connections and health. So expect that one of these days. My driving videos are where I share the research I've been writing down, and I've got 2 pages written with a Delta Dolce Vita masterpiece with Robert Oster terracotta ink. So, yeah. So I'm home. No snow this weekend, so it's warming up. Spring is coming, and we'll see. So maybe I'll be able to get out on the road more eventually. We'll see. So I want to thank you for watching. Thank you for your loyalty, and live a life. We'll see you later. Bye-bye.